Our question this week is a trick question. What time is it? At the North Pole.
Ooh.
Welcome to Two Doors Down. Today, time zones. A surprisingly complex topic. But let's return to that in a moment.
Yeah, let's talk about what's in the news this week, which happens to be presidential pardons. You know, I have a lot of opinions about presidential pardons, and I think that Joe Biden provided a pardon to Hunter because he felt Hunter had been attacked because his father was the president, and that was a political attack. And so even though he had promised all through his presidency that he had no intention of providing a pardon for Hunter, at the very end, he thought that
I think
he
it's
could
a
justify.
no-brainer that it was political.
Yes, I
And I
agree.
think it was a no-brainer that for the last 8 years or so that they've been attacking Trump, that was all political too. So I
They
think
both are.
it's political. However, I feel I don't support. I'm a right kind of a guy. I'm on the right-hand side of the political spectrum. But I don't support Joe Biden or Hunter Biden. I don't like them, and I don't like the policies. I don't like the left. That is irrelevant in this particular situation because I respect the office of president, whoever it is that is in office. And I believe that the presidential power of pardon should be unrestricted.
I agree. Actually, I love the whole concept of presidential pardons because there are injustices in our criminal justice system. We're human beings. We get things wrong all the time. And the check and balance, in my opinion, to counteract unjust decisions and mistakes that are made is the presidential pardon. In fact, I would like to see a lot more presidential pardons. I think there should be dozens of them every year because there are dozens of cases out there that are aching for a change, that society needs a change in some of these cases.
I tend to agree with you on this one. However, I also feel like there's no difference between what I would call the presidential power and the presidential power of pardoning. There's not much of a difference between that and just giving judges what their title is, which is judge. The judgment of a senior citizen, a senior character in our society that's been placed in a position to use his own judgment to judge whether somebody should be held accountable or not, whether they should get a really severe penalty. Laws, I think, are great to control all this stuff, but the judges should have more power than they do.
I agree with that, Chris. But sometimes judges get things wrong also.
Yeah, that's true.
And in fact, this summer, there were 2 men executed in the United States, in different states, 2, where courts found evidence that they believed they were innocent. But the governors were so hell-bent on doing executions.
Even prosecutors and lawmakers were standing up to try to stop
these executions, these 2 particular executions, and it didn't happen.
Yeah.
Joe Biden or whoever is president should jump in at those moments and provide a presidential pardon. We have to stop unjust.
It's murder is what it is. It's a governmental.
We murdered those
taking
2
the
men.
life of somebody
that
was innocent.
Yeah.
Even our
proven
government
innocent.
has proven it.
Yeah.
They've-
That's ridiculous. Why didn't he pardon them?
Right.
They asked for pardons. Why isn't it used more?
Right.
Why is it so rare? Has he pardoned anybody else in his entire 4 years?
I don't know, but
I don't know either, but
I have my doubts as to whether Hunter Biden is deserving of it, but it doesn't matter. I still think that the president, not Joe Biden specifically, but the president, whoever is holding the office, should have the unrestricted power to pardon whoever he thinks is worthy of it.
I agree, and I wish he'd use it more. It doesn't have to be reserved for sons or father-in-laws or family members. It must be used for those little people who have no other recourse.
Right. Yeah, so now back to time zones.
time zones. I thought this was going to be really simple. Like there's Eastern time zone and Central and Mountain and Pacific. And how hard is that?
That is not simple.
No.
Not only is it not simple, but time zones are a gateway to multiple understandings of so many different things that are affected by time zones. The Greenwich Mean Time was something that started in Greenwich, England.
Why? Why Greenwich? Who picked that point to start?
There were astronomers that had to understand what time it was, and so
they happened to live in Greenwich.
They established a standard that was a time standard. That it was back in the 1640s or something. It was like 300 or 400 years ago.
So England kind of was the center of the world back then.
Yes, and the center of technology and the center of cosmos and scientific exploration and all that kind of stuff. There was a lot of stuff going on, and the Greenwich Mean Time was the center of it.
Yeah, and I kept misspelling that word because nowhere is that W pronounced.
Yep, and it still isn't, so don't do it.
It's Greenwich time.
Greenwich,
yeah.
The international dateline is a part of time zones.
Yeah, and who drew that
I think
line?
It's fascinating
and
that
how do you know where it is?
It cuts right down through the middle of the Pacific. And I think they intentionally put it there so that it would have the least amount of impact on business and finance and everything else that happens in the world.
Wait a minute. Is it only on one side, the dateline?
Dateline is one
line. It's not like an equal line on the other side.
It's not a straight line, by the way.
Okay.
It's not a straight line. It zigzags all over the Pacific.
Why?
Because there's certain entities, political affiliations, meaning different countries and different states and so on and so forth, that want to be associated with their own kind. So if you cut down through the Aleutian Islands, you don't want the international dateline. You don't want
to separate them.
Yeah, you don't want a bunch of islands that are to the west of the international dateline to be on a time zone that is the date is the same as Russia. You want them all to be the same as the United States.
Okay.
So they moved the time zone around to accommodate that.
Interesting. That's just part of the complexity.
I've crossed the international dateline, I think, 8 times.
Wow. I didn't even know there was one.
Yeah, so crossing the international dateline it's fun because there's this moment where suddenly your clocks change by 24 hours.
And they do automatically?
Automatically.
If I had a smartwatch, if I had a smartphone, would it change?
I'm sure that your smartphone would probably update automatically.
But when you went across it, there weren't smartphones.
We didn't have smartphones.
So you had to rely on your own wit to make the change.
Oh,
that's a dangerous thing.
I'll tell you what, the sharpest change that ever happened is when I was relying on my own wit.
Oh, that's before you met me.
Oh, boy, talk about wit.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I know that really the time zones started because of trains.
Yes and no, but yeah, go ahead.
Trains take off from one point. It makes sense that everybody knows when noon is. It's when the sun is straight up. Now, I don't know how you measure that the sun's straight up. I can't picture that.
So let's put a train context to this, and let's say that there's one railroad track. And it goes from LA to New York in, say, 1820.
Okay.
And so there's one railroad track, and there's a train that leaves LA and another train that leaves New York, and they're both heading toward each other.
And
when they finally get close to each other, you've got to figure out exactly what time it is so that the one train can pull off to the side and let the other train go by.
You also need to know when the train's going to get there. So if it's an 8-hour train ride, but it starts in New York, it's like later than it is.
Basic scheduling so that you don't have train wrecks.
So the time zones help that. And it made it an even thing. So it's not like 8 o'clock in the whole United States, but it's 8 o'clock or 7 o'clock or 6 o'clock or 5 o'clock. It's easy to calculate.
I saw a map of the original 4 time zones in the United States, and it was really weird. It's nothing like what it is today. But Florida was a part of the Central Time Zone. And the Eastern Time Zone was really
just
looked like
Boston
the colonies.
Like
the original colonies down to South Carolina, and that was it. And so those were all over the place. Now, since then, they've had lots of different changes to time zones, but it wasn't until 1879 or something that there was this one particular guy that came up with the idea of time zones that would be global.
And there'd be
The
24 of them, maybe
24
1 hour apart.
Basically
Uh-huh.
24 1 hour apart, which was 15
degrees, which I don't even know what that means. Is that
Longitude are the lines that are vertical on a globe. And latitude, laying down, LA, laying down, the latitudes are the ones that are horizontal on the globe.
Okay.
And so the longitude are the ones that are most closely related to what we call time zones.
Oh.
And so those are the things that they guided where they were going with this whole thing. But they wanted somewhere in the middle of where the most of our population was to be about an hour from one time zone to the next, which is how they got the 24.
Mm-hmm.
Which all of this has an impact on so many different things. And navigation for shipping was one of them. So when they came up with the Greenwich Mean Time, which was that standard set back in the 1640s or whatever, they eventually got to a point where the... Are you looking at...
I got this cool kaleidoscope. I bought it for myself for my birthday. And when it gets too complicated and boring, I'm just gonna look through my little kaleidoscope and enjoy all the colors
You know,
while
that
you're
kaleidoscope
talking.
almost looks like some sort of utensil, a tool for calculating where your ship is at sea.
Oh, I knew there was a purpose for it.
They had little tools and instruments that looked like that kaleidoscope, which would give them an idea as to what exactly time-wise when it was noon, which is the highest point of the sun right directly above your ship.
How do you know it's not just a little bit here or a little bit there?
We're a podcast.
Oh.
And our theme is about time. And I'm okay with going into time, but we're not going to get into all the science of
Okay,
how
that's
you're
good. Because I think
how you're
I'd
going to
get
track
tired.
down the zenith
Yeah.
of the sun at noon over your spot.
I'd
But
get-
what we can do is we can say that if we know that it's noon here and we know what time it is in Greenwich, if we know what those two different
don't know
times
what
are, then
time
we
it
can
is in
calculate how
Greenwich.
far we are from Greenwich.
I don't know what time it is in Greenwich. Do I need to?
Anyway, this is going to be really difficult to get through this with you around. So ships could figure out, generally speaking, where they were horizontally across the ocean
Okay.
by using time.
People were
calculating
smarter
time.
back then because they didn't have smartphones.
They were definitely
They
smarter.
had to be the smart
They were
ones.
much smarter than some of the people that are around today. Don't you think, Toby?
I
Anyway.
definitely do.
Time zones also have an effect. What about space travel?
I don't know. What time is it in space?
Great question. I'm glad that you asked.
Uh-huh.
The International Space Station is floating around all over the place, and you can't tell what time it is on the International Space
because
Station.
it moves through
So
them
you know
all.
what they follow? Greenwich Mean Time.
Oh,
Yes, in the International Space
I
Station,
see.
Greenwich Mean Time.
Okay.
So there's a lot of when you are
what does
confused
it
about
mean
what
by
time it is.
mean time?
Oh,
What is mean?
Oh, get me into this topic now. So mean it's a mathematical average. And the
Oh.
problem is
Why don't they just say average?
because mean is different than average. It's mathematically it's just easier to understand it as an average. But basically what they did, Greenwich Mean Time, is the word mean is because the sun changes cosmically, astronomically, the sun over the earth changes because the angle of the earth changes. So in the summertime, it's angling differently toward the sun than it is in the wintertime.
Oh, yes, I do know that.
And I'm starting to hear
Well,
Are you hearing crickets?
Yes,
Because you're,
I am.
you're getting freakish.
It's getting too much for me because I just really want to know.
So they took
I wanna
an
hear the
average of all the
crickets.
different times in Greenwich and came up with the Greenwich Mean Time.
Oh.
Sort of an average of all the weird collective
Because Greenwich is so
differences
big that it's
over-
noon different times in Greenwich. parts
No,
of
but it
Greenwich?
is true that that the difference is so precise in the time of Greenwich Mean Time is so much different than just 20 miles away that you can see quite a difference.
That was the
in
problem
time.
with the trains. It wasn't just an hour time difference as
It
you
was
moved
down to
through.
the minute.
It was 10 and 5 and 3-minute time
And you don't want to
differences
crash into a
'cause
train
yeah,
because you don't know where you
yeah.
are. Yeah,
It would
that's
be
right.
confusing, I think.
Commercial air flights. Now, if we're going to talk about commercial air flights, I think we could, let's move on. How about U-Haul? I work
Yeah,
at U-Haul.
yeah.
I work at U-Haul, and here's the deal. I have 15 different programs open on my computer screen where I can help my customers get reservations.
Right.
And I talk to customers all over the United States and Canada.
Mhm.
So they're in many different time zones
Right.
all over the place, even in Hawaii.
Even Hawaii,
and
yeah.
Alaska.
Imagine there's U-Haul trucks in Hawaii. I
Right.
wonder how they got there.
Yeah, I think they drove them there. I think somebody moved there from California and
Yeah.
they had to drive
Yeah.
the U-Haul truck.
Mhm.
They have these little propellers on the back of them.
Mhm.
No, anyway, so U-Haul, I have these 15 different programs that are open. And there are some programs that are tuned to Arizona time because
Which is
that's
U-Haul's
corporate headquarters.
yeah.
And then there's other programs like the time clock that you check in so that you can get paid. That's on Arizona time. But there are other programs that I have open that have to do with the customer's time zone. And then we have still yet other ones that are relative to, a lot of them are already calibrated to my time zone so that they've been adjusted automatically by computer systems so that I can just use them without having to calculate a whole lot of things. But there's still a few that are left up to me to calculate. So when I'm communicating, when I send a text message to a customer and I tell that customer I'm going to call you at 5 o'clock, I'm telling that customer that I'm calling him at 5 o'clock his time.
Yes, and you need to know
But
what
I have to
his time
figure
is.
out what time it is here and then subtract 2 hours from it because Arizona is different by that much time. And the text message that I send them has to do with Arizona time frame. So all of these things, the way that it parlays is really very complex.
But a couple months ago, you would have had to subtract 3 hours because Arizona
Because
doesn't
of-
do daylight savings time.
and
It's
we do.
complicated. We mess everything up. We make it
Yes.
complicated.
Yes.
One thing I did learn that I thought was really interesting, when you use a kaleidoscope, you've got to point it down, not
Why is
up.
that?
When you try to point it up at the light, it doesn't work. You got to look down at a light.
Oh, really?
It's just interesting.
You have to look down at a light.
Instead of up. Up doesn't work.
Huh.
Chris, my whole life, I lived in the Central Time Zone. I think, yeah, even all the times I was in prison in different places, I was in Central Time Zone. And I was used to it. And we moved here to the Eastern Time Zone, and I thought I was going to hate it. But you know what? I think this is my favorite time zone because we're the first for everything. Like, it's New Year's Eve at the right time when the ball in New York falls. It's the right time. Everybody else is behind us. And I don't know. I like being in the Eastern Time Zone.
And I think there's some pros and cons to that because, for instance, when we're Chiefs fans today.
Yes.
And so I was New England fan for 20 years when they were at the peak, but now I married conveniently somebody from Kansas City.
Yes.
And now I'm a Patrick Mahomes and Chiefs fan.
Yes.
But when their broadcasts of different games come up on our media here, a lot of times it's expressed in this game starts at 8 o'clock Eastern time.
And so for us, it's right. But in
right.
Kansas City, you always had to calculate to make it right.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's cool. It makes me feel like the East Coast is a hub of power.
Yeah, it is.
In the United States.
Yeah.
Which I suppose is rightly so when we live right outside of Washington, D.C.,
Right.
which is the hub of power.
Which really, New York and Boston and Philadelphia are key cities in the United States, too. So I do think that
right.
it's where stuff happens.
So, time zone oddities. Interesting.
Oh, yeah. There's some weird stuff. China. They're a huge country. Are they
China?
bigger than the United States? Geographically?
China is not bigger than the United States, I don't believe.
But it's pretty big.
It is pretty big.
And they have decided they only have one time zone, and it's Beijing time.
Yes, but
the whole country's on the same time.
Just as a note, just to relate a little bit more to that, is that they have 1 billion people, but 9/10 of that population is around Beijing. It's all in one strip along the coast. So all of that, would be enough room for another 4 or 5 time zones in China, but it only affects a very small percentage of the population. Yes, they may be and honestly, I think that's so remote. They're out in the sticks so far that they probably don't much
Don't
care
use
about
time. They just
time or
go to
time
bed when
zones or
it's
anything.
time to go to
When it
bed. They
gets
don't care
dark,
what
they go to
time it
bed.
is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
probably
that could
so.
be. And
North Korea is what's that mean?
North Korea at one point, I think they changed back, but they decided they wanted to be different from everybody else. So they changed their time by 30 minutes.
Interesting. Just to be different.
Just to be different.
Yeah.
And then sometime, I think in 2018, they decided to change back.
That same concept, Afghanistan, they separated, they went to a different time zone than all the neighbors around them. They went to a different time zone to establish their own sovereignty. They wanted everybody to
Mm.
know that we're our own country and we're living by
Ah,
our own rules, and that you have to, you're the countries around them were forced to acknowledge that they had independence
mm-hmm,
from everybody else.
mm-hmm.
So I think that's an interesting way to use a time zone.
Yeah, it is.
Samoa?
Yeah, Samoa actually, they really, their commercial center was in Australia and New Zealand, but they were on the other side of the date line. So they actually voted to change to the other side of the date line to be
More
on the
closely
side with
associated
Australia and
with
New Zealand.
their commercial.
So they had to give up 24 hours of their whole life to change to
right.
the new date. So
Which in reality, you're not giving up any
no,
time.
but it's just weird. Well, I don't know what day they did it on, but June 1st they were on this date, and June 2nd never existed. They jumped to June 3rd
yeah.
or something.
Yeah, oddities.
Weird.
Strange things. And there are places within the United States that are similar to that, like Idaho. Northern Idaho is West Coast time because
Well,
Northern
it's
Idaho is more closely
yeah.
associated with the commercial centers
of Spokane, Washington.
Spokane, Washington.
So I
yeah.
looked at the map, and generally you can see time zones make some sense. But there's this little wedge in Kansas that's in Mountain Time, and a little wedge in Idaho that's in Pacific Time, and it didn't make sense to me because the line wasn't even straight. It jigged out to catch that piece and put it in a different time zone.
Yeah.
And so I went and looked it up, and it said because that particular geographical region was centered around the economical cities of something in the different time zones. So it made sense to put them in that time zone.
Yeah, so economics and culture
You know, they
and a bunch
probably
of other
lived in
things.
one place and drove to this other place for
Yeah.
jobs, and
Yeah.
it would be hard to drive 20 minutes and be in a different time zone and know what time you had to start work.
So what time is it at the North Pole?
Is this a trick question? Because it seems like if you were at the North Pole and you stepped to your left, you'd be in a time zone. If you stepped to your right, you'd be in another time zone, because isn't that where all the lines come together? All the time zone lines? Don't they start at the North Pole and go out? So actually they don't come together at the North Pole. They go out from the North Pole.
Exactly. You are brilliant.
I know it.
The way that you can articulate
Mhm.
just exactly how awesome the North Pole is, and that the time zones radiate from the North Pole and not
Yes,
into the North
that's
Pole.
right.
Yeah, that's
Because
brilliant.
everything starts in the north.
That's
you know?
absolutely brilliant. Anybody that's leaving the North Pole probably is not stepping or walking away from the North Pole. It's more likely, much more likely, that they're probably riding in a sleigh with 8 tiny reindeer,
Oh.
I think.
And that's why Santa can make it all the way around the world in one night, because he's from the North Pole where there's no time.
There's no time. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Actually,
We've made a big discovery here.
it's interesting because a lot of folks, again, when you default to, if you don't know if time is undefined at any particular point, like it is at the North Pole or on the International Space Station,
Mhm.
then a lot of folks just revert to the standard again, which is the Greenwich Mean Time. So if you go to the North Pole,
Oh,
it's
sweet
likely
Greenwich Mean Time.
Greenwich Mean
So
Time.
there is a time there.
There
I
is a
liked
time.
better thinking there was no time there.
Yeah. And I also like thinking that it's all time
Oh, yeah.
at the same
All
time,
the
which
time. It's all the times.
it's
That's interesting.
it's wacky weird. The North
Yeah,
Pole is a
it
weird
is.
place to be,
It
time-wise.
is. Mhm.
Felony murder. Here we are at a favorite part of the episode. This one is inspired, once again, by John Maynard.
Yeah, and for the first time today, there's John's ashes sitting right there on my stack of books next to my desk. So it's the first time. He was going to be on our first podcast and he died the day before our
The day
podcast.
before. Yeah.
And so now here he is sitting here overseeing all of our podcasts from this point forward.
And he still managed to escape prison in a box.
Yes, that I opened for him.
That you opened for him. Yep, that's right. You've done it for him twice in a box.
But that's it. I'm done.
I think you're done.
I'm done.
Yeah, I think he's done too.
Yeah, I think so. Unfortunately. So today I just want to talk a little bit about the Eckhart case. It's a pretty popular case. It's been in the papers for, I think this happened in 2012. But 5 teens were bored. Those dang teenagers, they get themselves in so much trouble. But they decided they were going to rob a house just for the fun of it. They wanted to rob a house that nobody was in because they didn't want to hurt anybody. So they happened to go to the house across the street. And they knocked on the door and they rang the doorbell and they made a bunch of noise and nobody came to the door.
And none of those boys were even carrying a weapon.
No. And they were like 15 and 16 years old. They were little kids, really. They couldn't even drive.
I can't harp enough that, number one, you're only as good as the company you keep. Number two, you don't have to be committing a murder. You can just be deciding that you're going to do something that's just seems like a fun thing to do when you're a 15-year-old to go ransack somebody's house.
Yeah.
Which happens to be a felony. And when somebody dies, you're going to do a life sentence for first-degree murder called felony murder.
These teens knocked on the door. They made a bunch of racket. Nobody came to the door. So they assumed the house was empty and they broke in. The homeowner, though, was there. He was upstairs taking a nap. And he was using a CPAP machine, so the noise of his CPAP machine drowned out these kids knocking. And so he heard the noise of them breaking in through the door, and he got his gun because he assumed he was being burglarized.
Right.
And he shot through the doorway blindly, and 2 of the boys were hit, and one of them died.
And of course, where we're going with this is
all 4 teens were convicted of felony murder.
Felony murder, which is the same stinking thing as first-degree murder, even though none of those boys had a gun on them, and all young.
Nobody had an intent to hurt anyone.
They're all young.
It was an accident. It was a dumb mistake. It's
just pure stupidity. And it's not just stupidity on the side of the boys. It's stupidity on the It's stupidity on the side of felony murder.
Yes.
It's a stupidity on our government that subscribes to this ridiculous rule of felony murder. Why would you want to take 4 boys that were just being 14, 15-year-old boys that were just being 15-year-olds and put them away in prison for the rest of their lives because of something stupid like that?
So there is a movement underway to get them resentenced, but who knows where it'll go.
Yeah, so here's what I'd like to do is that there's a case that I was willing to bring up earlier in our episode because it has to do with getting rid of time zones.
Ooh.
Okay? But the reason that I decided to wait until this segment of our episode is because there is a similarity in spirit between what humankind, what they did to resolve some consequences and issues concerning time zones and time and people all being on the same time or people being on separate times or the relationship between all those different times and what happens, the negative consequences. We talked about trains running into each other because they didn't know what time it was. Well, they came up with this. Let me read this. It says, time zones are a relatively recent invention. They date back to the 19th century and they were designed to reconcile the needs of then new railroad industry with the ingrained habits of a population new to clocks. They were a good idea at the time, but in the modern world, they cause more trouble than they are worth. Now that several generations of humanity are accustomed to abstracting time away from the happenstance of where the sun is located, it's time to do away with this barbarous relic of the past. Everyone on the planet should operate according to a single time, Greenwich Mean Time, which would be suggested by tradition, and then local schedules could differ from place to place according to personal taste and local practicality.
I still think that would be a dumb idea. It doesn't save anything because here's what you got to do. So it's 12 o'clock everywhere, but you got to stop and think, where are they? Is it 12 o'clock and that's the time they're having breakfast, or is it the middle of the night for them? So you still got to calculate in order to interact with someone in a different time zone.
The author that wrote this was making an argument saying that we could get rid of time zones, and they cite how time zones are a mess and what they do to different.
I don't think we could.
It goes on, but
I don't want to go on and on and on.
I wrote down a little bit about this, and I said, however, much of the original argument compares to the original arguments for felony murder. So when they came up with a solution to the lack of technology that they had 400 years ago when they came up with felony murder, when they didn't have DNA, when they didn't have
cameras everywhere,
fingerprints, and they didn't have cameras on every corner everywhere catching everything that everybody does, and cameras on their phones that are catching all of this stuff, when they're recording everything. There's so much, and DNA and everything else that today's technology really renders the whole concept of felony murder, which was something unnecessary. We don't need, and it's the same thing that this article was making an argument about time zones.
Interesting. So that's an interesting connection.
Now, having said that, I'm still with you, because first, the time zone thing, if we're talking about the time zone argument to get rid of it, this is a global doctrine today that is deeply ingrained in our culture, if not our regulatory standards. And to change it now would surely be akin to the fears of Y2K on mega steroids.
Oh, yeah, that was a crazy mess, too. I wonder if that's in our box, our basket of tops.
Y2K is probably a good one to add to the basket, so maybe we should do that. Anyway, that's all I had to say about that, but I just think that was a fascinating comparison between time zones and somebody that's arguing to get rid of them and felony murder, where we're trying to argue that we should get rid of felony murder.
I like that. So I think you have an article about felony murder.
I do. So this article is interesting. I read the entire thing, which is probably a 15-page. It's a college paper, basically, that is a description of felony murder and some arguments as to why it really, what it boils down to is there's a couple of things in here that I wanted to refer to specifically.
Yeah, and this document's from the Sentencing Project, which we'll put a link to it on our website.
Absolutely. Not just the link on the website, but our listeners, really, if there was anything that I could encourage them to participate in, just simply read this document, even if it's just a scan, just so you can get an idea as to what's going on with it. But I think there's a lot of extremely valuable information in here. But let me just read this one paragraph. The rationale of the felony murder doctrine is that one who commits a felony is a bad person with a bad state of mind, and he has caused a bad result, so that we should not worry too much about the fact that the fatal result he accomplished was quite different and a good deal worse than the bad result he intended. What this is saying, what this whole comment is saying, is it's saying that if you were involved, even in, you don't have to be involved in the murder itself, the killing of a person. Now, this is an argument, in my opinion, this is an argument for felony murder, which is not something we usually share in our podcast, but I thought that it was noteworthy because I've seen only, this may be the only thing that I've ever seen or read anywhere that is an advocacy for felony murder, to keep it on the books.
I thought this whole thing was about ending felony murder.
It is, but this is a particular argument that was made by a particular, it was a professor, what was his name? It's on here somewhere. But anyway, he was basically making an argument and letting us know that there are certain understandings of what felony murder is, what the intention of the rule is.
It's ridiculous.
And you don't like it.
It's ridiculous because, so maybe they were intending to commit a crime, but they weren't intending to commit a murder. So why are they sentenced for a murder?
Okay, so
that's ridiculous.
This is the opposing argument to that.
I'm
and
glad
I wanted
you
to
have
share
that.
this.
Good.
So this was another, maybe a paragraph and a much longer story here, but in Graham versus Florida in 2010, the Supreme Court established that youth defendants who did not kill or intend to kill have a twice, and this is in quotes, twice diminished moral culpability due
Ah,
to their age and their not having killed, and are therefore less deserving of extreme punishment.
yeah. I like that they put a number to it. That's interesting.
You and I have looked into this,
Mhm.
completely irrelevant from felony murder or from our podcast or anything else. But back when I was we studied psychologically that there's proof. They have proven that people are not fully matured to the idea that they understand consequences until they come to the age of
25.
24.
Oh,
25, yeah.
yeah.
So 24, 25 years old is when the brain
Mhm.
finally gets to a point where it starts to understand consequences.
Yeah.
And
That's
so
an
when you're
important
16
point.
years old,
Right. You definitely
you
don't.
do stupid stuff.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
This whole article goes on. There's more and more stuff here to go on, and I'd like to go through it all, but I just don't. I think
Well,
that
we can
probably the best
refer to
thing to
that
do
in
is
other
just.
episodes too. We'll bring pieces of it in. That's how
Yes,
we'll
I
get it
agree.
all out there. But I will put it on the website.
I agree. So if you don't mind, let's go to, I think there's still a couple of other things that are articles that we have that we're going to look into here. So where are we here?
I think we're done with the articles.
Oh, so felony murder itself is a felony, right?
Yeah. We get that question all the time, don't we? We got it today at a Toastmasters group when we were talking about felony murder. They're like, well,
A U.S.
of
Marshal
course,
of all people.
a murder is a felony. So what are you talking about felony murder?
Yeah.
It is confusing, but oh, I do have an article. So here I go.
That's what I was talking about. Yeah.
I'm off track.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that we should make note here is that felony murder, the term felony murder, most people don't understand that you need to have quotation marks around it because it's a phrase, it's a legal
Right.
doctrine.
Right.
And a lot of people don't understand that
Because
felony
murder
is
is a felony. So
Right.
when you say we want to end felony murder, they're like, no, we don't. We want to convict murderers.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
of
not,
felonies. Yeah, and
Right.
we do too. We're
Yeah.
not advocates for ending murder
Mhm.
convictions. We are advocating for the end of a loophole.
So I found this great article in Forbes, and I'll put a link to that as well. But this came out just this last June. So it's a really current article. And I'm just going to sum it up really quick. It says murder must show intent to convict. That's the definition of a murder conviction. However, a legal doctrine called felony murder,
In quotes.
right, creates an exception, a loophole, a secret passage, a back door around intent, leading to convictions of murder and punishments including life without parole and even execution. This is convictions when there was not an iota of intent by the person being convicted. So that's what makes it wrong. A murder conviction must show an intent to kill someone.
I want to read it again, so I'm going to read it one more time.
All right.
Murder must show intent to convict. So that's just plain old murder.
In order to
First-degree
convict
murder
someone
or
of
whatever.
murder, we have to be able to show intent.
That the person that murdered somebody else intended to take the life of the
Yes,
person that they
correct.
killed.
Right.
That they murdered. So that intent is really an important
Mhm.
aspect here. However, a legal doctrine called felony murder, and felony murder is not just murder, this is something else. So felony murder is really when somebody hasn't committed any crime. No, maybe they've committed a felony, maybe they were involved in a felony.
Sure, they were
but they
involved
don't
in a
have to be.
felony.
They
but-
don't have to
right.
be. They just have to be somehow related. And we'll give
Attached to it.
examples in just a second. But the point is that the doctrine of felony murder creates an exception, a loophole, a secret passage, a back door around intent, So it's this felony murder
This little
enables
cheating
prosecutors to
loophole.
cheat their way to a conviction when
Without doing
somebody
any
doesn't
work
have any
for it.
intention of killing
Right.
anybody, that they can get around what is a requirement to convict somebody of murder. They can use felony murder to get around that.
That's right.
And it sickens me.
It's wrong. And I'd probably say 80 to 90% of the felony murder convictions are juveniles.
Yes, there's a lot of them. That part of the felony murder on an on ramp for extreme sentencing, that article that I was reading from a moment ago, a lot of it has to do with that.
That's not an article, that's a whole paper.
That is a paper, yeah.
Yeah.
And I just think that it's really important to understand that felony murder, not only is it's skewed toward bringing kids, minors, to an unreasonable, what they call justice.
Yes.
It's also against minorities and women wind up getting felony murder because their hubbies are drug dealers.
Or their boyfriends
or whatever
Right.
are drug dealers, and the women happen to be somewhere in the circle of the whole thing, and prosecutors like to take women to prison for their lives, or put them on death row because of felony murder.
So in some states, felony murder can be charged even if the victim was not murdered during the crime.
Yeah.
It could be that, I don't know, a victim broke his toe during the crime, and later he got an infection and died from the infection from the broken toe.
Yeah,
and
it's
you'll be charged
ridiculous
with murder.
things like that. Yeah, it is, absolutely. All right, so now it's time to draw a card from our basket and reveal the topic of our next episode. Let's see what time has in store for us.
I hope you pick a really good one. This is almost like Christmas. I get so excited. I want it to be a good one. I saw some in there I wanted. What have we got?
Time in art and literature.
Ooh,
how creatives capture
Oh my
time.
gosh, this is my card. I'm so excited.
Oh my word, I am
We get to be creative. That's better than time zones.
Oh my word. Okay, we'll have to
Time in art
we'll
and
drag
literature.
ourselves through it.
Yeah. You're going to like it too, Chris. I already know it.
I can't wait.
From whichever time zone you hail, we wish you a happy holiday season. Remember, especially if you're a teenager, you're only as good as the company you keep. Choose wisely.
Share your own reflections and stories using hashtag 2Dorrs time zones and join the conversation from your time zone. This is Christian and Toby Dorr from Eastern Standard Time, reminding you to make an impact with the moments you have. 2 Doors Down. It's about time.
Subscribe on YouTube at 2 Doors Down. For exclusive content, check out our Patreon channel. Our website is 2doorsdown.com.
Until next time.